Hi, everybody. My name is Humphrey Wireko. I am a principal. I'm an associate principal with Cross Boundary Energy Access, also known as CBEA. CBEA is part of the Cross Boundary Group, which is a mission-driven investment firm that unlocks capital for sustainable growth and strong returns in underserved markets. Specifically, Cross Boundary Energy Access, my team, the team that I work on, we are focused on unlocking capital for universal electrification in Africa, and specifically using project finance to bring capital at scale into mini grids. And so today, I have the pleasure of moderating a panel with a group of really fantastic panelists who can talk in detail about some of the opportunities, challenges, questions, et cetera, in the mini grid financing landscape. But before I do that, what I will be doing is going into a bit of detail on some of the work that we've been doing here at Cross Boundary Energy Access on an initiative that we call our open source initiative, where we have essentially shared the details of what we've learned over the last couple of years trying to bring project finance into the mini grid sector. And so without further ado, I think that before this and for your panel, for the discussion on the app that you're using, there should be a link on the bottom that you can click on, and it can take you to the Cross Boundary Energy Access website, which I'll be using for this presentation. And on that website, you can see all of the information that I'll be sharing. You can download our open source documents, the white paper, et cetera. And so let me actually go ahead and share my screen here. So here you have the Cross Boundary Energy Access open source website. And maybe before I jump into this, would like to focus a bit on really what is this open source. And so this is something that CBEA has kind of developed in conjunction with quite a few partners. And so maybe first worth mentioning the developers. So PowerGen, Standard Microgrid, with which we have worked very closely to come up with this approach to financing mini grids at scale, as well as worth mentioning the lawyers Foley Hoag, as well as Norton Rose Fulbright, who have done a great job of working with us to structure and draft bankable term sheets and contracts for project financing mini grids as well. Our investors, which would be Ken Yarth, the Doughton Foundation, the Renewable Energy Performance Platform, as well as the Rockefeller Foundation as well, who've been quite critical for bringing us to this point, as well as everything that Cross Boundary Energy Access has been doing has been supported by the Shell Foundation and UK Aid and Power Africa. And so maybe if we back up a bit, for those of you who were able to join this AGM last year, CBEA, we presented a bit on the idea of mini grids being infrastructure, and the idea that if you want to treat mini grids like infrastructure, it's important that governments, as well as developers and financiers, all treat mini grids like infrastructure in order to bring the type of infrastructure capital needed into the sector. And so what we'll be doing today, I guess, is a bit of a deep dive on exactly what we mean when we talk about investing in mini grids as infrastructure. And so over the last late last year, Cross Boundary Energy Access, we open sourced and we shared essentially what we have learned about project financing mini grids, and we put the information here on the website so that you can download, for example, the information and engage with the content, hopefully with the idea that it can be helpful to you, whether you're a developer or a financier, and that it can help bring scale to the sector. So when we say open source, one of the questions is, what exactly do we mean? And in that, I think the first thing is the white paper that we've shared and that you can download here on the website. It is our full report, which has the keys, all of the keys to our approach. It kind of describes some of the challenges of turning mini grids into infrastructure investments, as well as the approach that we use to overcome them. And it also is, I believe, quite frank in how it lays out some of the outstanding challenges that remain and that we're still working on trying to solve, and that we hope to try to solve as a sector. Also, what we have on the open source website is we will be sharing term sheets for the project finance contracts that we have drafted with our partners. These term sheets are really critical in that they align the incentives between the owner and the operator. And this can be a really challenging part of developing, not only the relationship between the owner and the operator, but really making these contracts bankable and something that can work over the long term. And so if you're interested in receiving those when we release them in May, you can click the link here on the website to sign up and be notified when those come out. Another thing we're sharing is a project finance model. And so this is a bankable model that we have used to raise debt, senior debt, which we think can be helpful to developers as well as financiers. When we share it, what you'll see inside of it is that it includes the very conservative assumptions that we have used to try to raise senior debt into the mini grid sector. And then lastly, what I want to mention is that we are convening an investor group. So there have been, let's say, a long list of investors, private financiers, who want to scale finance into the mini grid sector, who we will be meeting with on a quarterly basis with the idea of saying, look, how can we kind of improve this approach, as well as develop further ideas, further information that we can share with the sector, with governments, with developers on how we bring capital into the mini grid sector at scale. And so one of the questions that we get when we got a lot, let's say last year, is why open source? If this is something that we have worked on for so long, this is kind of the culmination of quite a bit of our learnings, why would we put it on a website and share it with everybody? And I think here maybe a good analogy is with electric vehicles. And so here it's like we're saying that, look, we need a new approach. For example, with electric vehicles, the idea is they need a new approach to make transport environmentally sustainable. And the idea there is that let's share, how we designed our electric car. And the idea is that we know this works, but we also know it could be better. And another thing we know is that we need more manufacturers of electric vehicles, and we also understand that there are other ways to have sustainable transport besides electric vehicles, for example, hydrogen fuel cars. And so here, when it comes to open source, the idea is we do want people to engage in this. We engage with this. We want the idea to be that we can work with it, we can improve upon it, and at the same time, this can help the sector scale. But by no means is it, the only way, for example, to bring capital at scale into the mini grid sector. And so if you are here on this website, maybe there are a few things that you can do. You can obviously take a look through here, see the information that we have, download the full report, sign up to be notified. On top of that, you can kind of come here to the FAQs section, and you can see maybe a high level, if you don't want to read, the 30-page report, and take a look at how we really speak to explaining this open source approach in 3 minutes. And the key thing to this is that the approach really has 3 distinctive features, right? So it's that we want to isolate mini grids, we want to allocate the risks and revenues, and then we want to aggregate the assets. And so let me just take a minute to dive into each of those. So when it comes to isolating the mini grids and the assets and the customer revenues, the idea here is that, and I think we spoke about this a bit more in depth last year at the AGM. But the idea is that we know that mini grid developers take part in so many different activities. They're developing sites, they're doing EPC work and construction, they're going out strategically, applying for tenders, etc. But those activities have quite a different risk profile than the actual infrastructure asset, which is there in the ground and is generating long-term inflation-linked revenues from customer payments. And so by separating the mini grid assets and those revenues from the rest of the activities, that's very critical to getting this infrastructure investment approach that we're trying to bring to light here. So that's one step that you can see kind of more in detail when you engage with the materials on the website. Number two is allocating. And so this is all about how you appropriately allocate the revenues, the risks, the costs in long-term contracts between the developer slash operator, because you need to have a long-term operating contract there as well. Once you've isolated the assets and once the financier has project financed them and owns, let's say, an SPV that owns the assets. And then so you have a lot to allocate between the developer operator and the financier. And then of course you have any other investors, senior lender as well. And so really about how you allocate those risks and there are quite a few, let's say, complicated features of how to do so. I think with our partners, what we've put in this in the white paper should really go through that in detail and kind of the thinking of how we went about doing so. And then lastly is aggregating, right? We know that the cost of a typical rural mini grid is usually, just a couple $100,000, but project finance usually wants to come in with much larger ticket sizes of $5 million or $10 million. And so this kind of speaks to how we aggregate those much smaller individual mini grids into a much larger portfolio of mini grids in a given country, and then how we can aggregate those individual portfolios of mini grids into a much larger facility that's able to attract the type of finance at scale. And one last thing before we go to the panel that I'll touch upon is in the white paper, you'll see kind of overview of some of the risks that and the mitigation strategies of what remains. And so I think that the idea here is that this white paper is quite clear on not only the approach, but still some of the really big challenges that remain in the sector. And so with that, I think I'd like to segue into the panel and so that the panelists can really speak about what they've seen from a finance perspective in the mini grid sector, the work that their individual firms are doing to either finance mini grids or help make them more financeable. I think you'll find those responses quite interesting. And then again, some of the challenges that remain and what we might be able to do about that. And so our panel includes Alex Graham, Cliff Aaron, Daphne Pitt, Jeff Manley, Eva Indrunetti, and all of them will introduce themselves now. So I think we'll start with Alex, if you'd like to give a bit of an introduction of yourself. Alex?
Sorry, I was on mute. Can you hear me okay?
I can, yeah. Great.
Cool. Hi. So I'm a business development manager at Infraco Africa. I'm based in Nairobi. Infraco Africa is part of something called the Private Infrastructure Development Group. We're a group of 5 companies offering different infrastructure solutions in sub-Saharan Africa. Specifically, Infraco Africa partners with developers to take projects from an early stage through to a bankable investment opportunity that can attract follow-on private sector capital. We receive our funding from our owners, the UK, the Netherlands and Switzerland. That's specifically into Infraco Africa. There's other funding coming into the Pitch Group as a whole. And our purpose is to alleviate poverty through mobilizing private sector expertise and finance to develop high quality infrastructure projects. In addition to Infraco Africa under Pidge, we have our sister companies. I just want to give a shout out to them. We've got Infraco Asia, who has the same mandate as Infraco Africa, but they're focused on Asia. Emerging Africa Infrastructure Fund, they're a long-term debt provider. And then Garanco, who provide credit solutions to try and unlock local currency finance. Specifically within the mini-grid sector, we've been active in this sector for 7 or so years now. Really trying to figure out how we can be additional and mobilize private sector capital in the sector. So there's a lot's happened, and hopefully we'll get into that.
Thank you, Alex. Cliff, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Cliff Aaron. I'm the principal of GreenMax Capital Group. We're a niche advisory and fund management team focused on clean energy and emerging markets. We've been in business for 27 years now, and we've been working in Africa since 2005. We work both as transaction advisors and as fund managers. As transaction advisors, we help off-grid entrepreneurs and mini-grid developers to raise both equity and debt. For the mini-grid space, we see a good amount of equity pouring into the space, which is almost counterintuitive since no one is, or very few are able to say that they're profitable, but yet the interest from equity side has remained quite strong. And now all of us in the sector are focused on, how do we increase the availability of debt financing, and particularly local currency financing, which is so needed in the space. As fund managers, we are launching two different instruments in parallel to approach scaling up of local currency financing in the off-grid space in two different ways. We believe very strongly that the only way to meet SDG 7 goals is to find new and creative ways to crowd in private investment and institutional investors and commercial lenders. Our first instrument is called Green for Access First Loss Facility, which partners with local financial institutions to provide a first loss cash reserve account that covers up to 20% of loss across a portfolio of energy access loans. And we have two models for that. One is focused on the PAYGO space, and the second is focused on portfolios of mini grids. Our second platform is called Green Street Africa, and that is an aggregation platform that prepares large portfolios of distributed generation projects, specifically at public facilities, and prepares them for public tender to be implemented by DESCOs under long-term contracts with the government off-takers, underwritten by payment guarantees that are provided by our DFI partners, and financed through local currency bond issues that also have a guarantee component to protect repayment to bondholders. We're launching that in Nigeria for a portfolio of distributed generation projects at urban hospitals that are essentially urban mini grids, because these are multi-building facilities, and the goal is eventually these urban mini grids will begin to connect surrounding housing blocks. as well. I'll end it there for now.
Sounds good. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that, Cliff. So Daphne, would you be able to please introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Thank you, Humphrey, and thank you all for having me here today, and thanks for the very interesting introduction. My name is indeed Daphne Pitt. I'm working as a founder of Pitt Pure Power, but that's just me, myself, and I. I'm an independent consultant. I've been working in renewable energy and energy access sustainability since early 2000s. My last job was with the Doen Foundation, so one of the financiers you had on your slide, Humphrey. Indeed working a lot in energy access, namely in Eastern Africa and in India. Also working already then with a few of the mini grid companies when it was really still very early stage. I left the Doen Foundation early 2017, and I've been working as an independent consultant ever since. Some of the parties and organizations I've been working with and for are Electrify and Gogla, the CIMA funds, Melinda Minigrids, GAM Power, and currently I am involved mostly with the Get Invest Finance Catalyst and with TCX. And at the Get Invest Finance Catalyst, we provide project preparation. It's a project preparation facility, so we can provide TA for companies that want to be ready for investment. And TCX is working a lot on actually hedging local currency risks. And I will definitely talk more about both of them later on today. So what else can I tell? That I mostly focus on a triangle of early stage business mentoring, finance, and strategic or business development. And I really hope to be able to contribute today on all those aspects.
All right. Thank you for that. Jeff, would you be able to go ahead and do a quick intro?
Hi, everyone. My name is Jeff Manley from CDC Group. We are the UK development finance institution, and we invest to support the private sector across Africa and South Asia. I sit in the energy access and efficiency team. We invest across the range of decentralized energy. We provide debt capital from everything from solar home systems to mini grids to commercial and industrial solar, as well as resource efficiency. And my team sits within a broader infrastructure and climate vertical that includes other debt, equity, and funds investment teams that support broader infrastructure development. We have an extensive portfolio in the energy access space more broadly, although most of that is not in the mini grid sector. So we're relatively new, but we are developing strategies to support that, and we already have some investments in place. We also invest in developing platforms. So for example, relevant to the mini grid space, a couple of years ago, we created a new platform called GridWorks that includes mini grids within its mandate. So yeah, we're looking forward to hopefully deploying much more capital to help the mini grid sector develop in the future.
All right. Thank you. And lastly, but certainly not least, Eva, if you want to do a quick intro.
Thanks, Humphrey. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Eva Indrunete. I'm the Policy and Partnerships Manager at Camco Clean Energy. Camco is a fund manager. We are headquartered in London with offices in Accra, Nairobi, Johannesburg, and Helsinki. We are the manager of the Renewable Energy Performance Platform, or REP in short. That is where our mini grid experience largely comes from over the past 5 years or so. REP is a facility that is a 149 pounds facility to support small-scale renewable energy development across sub-Saharan Africa. It's a very bottom-up and demand-driven facility to support private developers. And it's not exclusively focused on mini-grids. We can also finance on-grid projects and SHS companies, but mini-grids have formed a large part of REP's portfolio since the days of its inception. I probably also missed the fact that it's funded by UK government's climate finance through the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. So in the mini-grid space, in line with REP's mandate, our portfolio is quite diverse, both in terms of countries, financing instruments, financing quantum, and other aspects. So to name just a few, we started off, I think, by providing development finance in the form of convertible loans to a local developer in Nigeria. We have done the same in Rwanda. We have partnered, of course, with CBEA on their initial project through the project finance approach that was introduced by Humphrey, and that was in partnership with PowerGen in Tanzania. We also supported PowerGen's Series B equity raise. So as you can see, quite a diverse portfolio. In addition to REP, we are now also, as Camco, launching a new initiative that will focus on scaling up financing for energy efficiency and C&I in select sub-Saharan African markets. And as I said, I'm working as a policy and partnerships manager, and that is also linked to the fact that part of REP's theory of change is to try to use the knowledge that we gain through our investments to try and support enabling environment development in the markets where we operate.
All right. Thank you for that. So I mean, I think you can get the idea from those introductions that we have just an extremely exciting and diverse panel of players in the space here to talk through some of these questions that I have. And so let me just go ahead and get started. So to the folks on the panel who are financing mini grids, you are part of a growing group of investors that are doing transactions in the mini grid space. Some of you have been in the mini grid space for a number of years. Others of you are kind of newer into specifically financing mini grids, but you have quite a bit of experience financing, let's say, off-grid projects, power projects on the continent, etc. So I would ask you to speak to your experience, specifically investing in mini grids thus far, or if you haven't been really investing in mini grids, maybe a bit more about some of the challenges to investing in the mini grid sector that you've faced. And so, yeah, let's go ahead and I don't know which panelist would like to take that question first. I'll leave it to, I'll leave it to you to decide, but. I'll just maybe Jeff, you could take that question first, coming from the angle of maybe having done less specific mini grid investments, but looking really closely at the space right now.
Yeah, sure. Happy to kick things off. So, I mean, we have actually been looking at mini grids for quite some time, and we have actually made some investments. We actually made a very early investment in DRC in Virunga, where we took, it was almost like a CSR type of project, but with the ambition of making it much more commercial and bankable. And we've over time been able to grow that to, it's a hydro-based scheme, and we've been able to grow that to over 30 megawatts, supplying power into Goma. And interestingly, about 20% of the power is now sort of under offtake. So we've been able to kind of build the offtake up around that. And then, as I mentioned also in my introduction, a couple of years ago, we created a platform called GridWorks. GridWorks is active providing, sort of early stage equity and development into the mini grid sector, amongst other things around transmission and distribution, as well as C&I solar. And so that's another way that we've already invested in the sector, as well as through some of the fund exposures that we have that have supported mini grid developers indirectly. But I guess, coming from my perspective, we haven't actually deployed debt capital yet, but it's an area that we developed strategy around last year. And I think maybe just, I can highlight a few of the aspects of that strategy, are sort of the key things that we're looking for, which I think respond to some of the challenges that we've seen around investing in the mini grid sector. So I think the first one that you alluded to as well in your presentation, Humphrey, is just the issue around aggregation and scale. So individually, The mini grids are too small for us to look at. We're going to have to do due diligence, and so it makes sense for us to try to aggregate those opportunities as much as possible. So we are looking for different platforms. It could be through funds, and ways to sort of bring together portfolios of mini grid assets that we could finance. The other piece I think really relates to country. So I think the country angle is really important, and that comes in through the regulatory framework. So I think in an ideal world, we're looking to prioritize countries where they have a clear national electrification strategy that sort of sets out, this is what we want to do through grid extension, this is what we want to do through mini grids, and this is what we want to do through solar home systems, so that there's a coherent approach and some guidance to developers as to where they see mini grids fitting into that plan, and then a framework that deals with some of the key issues around the tariffs that can be charged and how those might change or escalate in the future. How do we deal with permitting, land, et cetera? How do you manage grid arrival risk? So, acknowledging that all of those things may not be in place, and certainly it may not be proven as of yet, but I think it's important for governments to show leadership around the regulatory framework. And then given we've just seen that business models are very challenging at this point, given the cost per connection and the ARPUs that you're going to be able to generate initially. There has to be some subsidy. So we are looking for structured donor programs that can provide that, at least I think in the near to medium term. Hopefully, maybe there's a future where those aren't required, but for the near term, at least, I think that's going to be necessary. And wanting to see that that's well structured, that the funding is budgeted. You don't want to take risk on the funding materializing, but I think it also has to hold the developers accountable, so that it's linked to milestones and achieving things. So RBF type programs I think are absolutely appropriate. And then, obviously looking at the developers, it's all relative, but, looking for developers that have track record where we can get comfortable with the technical expertise that is in the company, as well as the equity support to keep that going. And I think, so those are some of the main things that that we're looking for. And then I think in exchange, what we think we can bring to the table is, sort of flexible long-term debt. We generally agree with the idea that these are longer-term assets and they are going to need longer-term financing. I think it has to be proven out. So I don't think you can just jump to, your typical kind of IPP type tenors. But, we are willing to look out to, say, 10-year type facilities, which we think can provide some of the, the duration that's necessary to finance these assets in a way that's sustainable. As I mentioned, around aggregation, we're also willing to look at smaller tickets than we typically would in the mini grid space. So, we could go down as small as, maybe 3 million, 5 million, and that's, much below what CDC would typically be looking for in other sectors. So trying to adapt our approach to the mini grid space. And that's kind of an overview of where we think we're headed on the debt side.
Wow. That was such a comprehensive response, right? You hit on so many parts of the sector and all the different stakeholders, whether it be the finance side, the government side, what's needed from developers, the challenges as well. And I think that as we go into this panel, we'll definitely want to dive a bit deeper into some of those particular points that you hit. Before we do that, would like to open it up to some of the other finance folks, financiers, to see if there's anything you'd like to add to that question on your experience investing in mini grids and the challenges and the opportunities you maybe see in the space. So I will pass it off to Alex to see if there's anything you'd like to add there.
Sure. Yeah, I guess I feel like we come from a bit of a different perspective. I mean, we're an early stage equity investor, so fundamentally, I guess our capital is different. But as I said before in the introduction, we've been looking at the sector for quite some time now, and if you go back, 7 or so years, it was a very different landscape. Most of the developers were focused on East Africa, Kenya, Tanzania. The regulatory and policy frameworks were really just being put into action in these countries, and there were limited programs, and arguably, I think, as Infra Africa, we were maybe almost too early for the type of capital that we provide. The majority of capital coming in at that stage was corporate funding, friends and families, and developers were really sort of starting off on the first 2 or 3, maybe 10 sites. And if you fast forward to today, I think there has been a big change. We're seeing a lot more. We're seeing a number of other programs kicking off, predominantly in West Africa, actually. A lot more donor funding coming in, a lot more capital coming in. There are a lot more financiers looking at the sector, and developers are now starting to reach that scale where we can kind of see the light at the end of the tunnel. But there's still so many challenges. There is challenges in terms of standardization across programs, regulatory and policy frameworks, and even as great as it is that all of the different types of infrastructure capital are coming in, they're all sort of slightly different and nuanced, and we're seeing more and more capital coming in the kind of construction phase, I would say, and still kind of a gap in the kind of, I would say, the capital that can come in, a bit like Infra Africa, that come in and take that either the construction risk and then stay in longer to make sure that these projects are bankable and operationalized, and more so the longer term capital, like the capital that CBA funds. So I think there's been some great traction, but still a long way to go. I mean, we've made some early stage investments in Zambia, Sana Microgrid, Rhodesia, and Tanzania, and more recently invested in PowerGen in Sierra Leone. And that's probably one of our biggest investments, 6.9 million, to deploy 41 sites across the eastern and southern part of Sierra Leone, 12,500 connections. And just saying that, I can't imagine saying that was just not even a reality 7 years ago. Happy to go into more details on some of the challenges we're still facing.
Nice. Thank you for that, Alex. And I think it's just really interesting to get, and it will continue to be interesting to get your perspective on this panel, given how long InfraCo has been in the mini grid sector and making these investments. And like you said, the specific role and the risks that you are willing to take when it comes to the long-term, the construction and the long-term operations that you don't really see a lot of in the sector. I want to pass it over to Yeva to see if there was anything you'd like to add to this question from a financing perspective.
Thanks, Humphrey. So I think in terms of having been involved in the sector, we're a bit similar to InfraCo. So REP has been, as I said, I think we made the first development finance. We added the first company to our portfolio in 2016. So we can, but I think, and as I said, it's a mix of of different instruments. So we've been trying sort of to be flexible and be sort of demand driven. One of the key aspects for REP is also to be additional, and another one is to be contributing to transformational change. So I guess we're sort of tend to go to places where others are not going, with a view of trying to attract new actors into the field. And I don't know how much of that has been our contribution, but it's really great to see that we have a diverse panel today, and we have Jeff from CDC, and he's only one DFI representative who are very strongly now looking at this field. So I think it's a learning curve for all of us, and as Jeff mentioned, they're still also trying to work out what works for them. Here, REP is very keen to also share our experiences, I guess. As a lender, perhaps from that kind of hat, just in terms of the key risks that we continue to see. I would probably single out three, and some of them have already been mentioned. So I guess it's just a reiteration, but one of them is of course the continuing demand risk. Here we have seen some interesting, of course, interventions from the developers themselves. So increasingly they are entering the productive use space, and there are different business models there that are now sort of scaling up, and a lot of learning being generated as we speak. So this is something that we're monitoring closely, but the ecosystem, I think, is still sort of in development. Secondly, the regulatory risk, of course. I mean, as we speak, we have regulations being in advanced stages now in Kenya, which is very encouraging. We had regulations in the last few years released that are considered to be very positive in Nigeria, and Sierra Leone have been approved, just to mention a few. But as Jeff was saying, I think, while it's very important to celebrate these developments and it's a very important first step, I think if you look at the details, some of the specific elements that are critical for developers and financiers, such as having clear national planning with the mini-grids being acknowledged as part of the solution, having clarity on where the grid extension might go in the next X years, and that can't be just the next few years, because as we are talking today, we're seeing mini-grids as an infrastructure investment. So that is very important, as well as, of course, the tariff provisions and when it comes to grid encroachment, sort of compensation and these kinds of questions. So on this point, REP has been also trying to voice, I guess, the perspective of of a financier by trying to engage with regulators and development partners to sort of highlight some of our perspective on these aspects, and then trying to get some change in the enabling environment. This is something we're continuing to do. And the third aspect, I think, that I would raise as well as the key risk that is persistent is the currency risk. I think it's, unless we're speaking about larger portfolio projects and really with sort of more established cash flows, it's still difficult to hedge this risk. And here, of course, I'm sure we'll speak about some of the solutions. I think we would like to see perhaps some of the donor and government programs being sort of starting to address this question. But yeah, I guess I can leave that for later.
Thank you, Yeva, for that. And no, I think you did a fantastic job of doing my job as the moderator, because you gave a perfect segue into the next question, which is, I mean, we're fortunate to have Cliff and Daphne on this panel, and both of you have been doing a substantial amount of work in this sector, really trying to solve some of those challenges that Yeva just raised and that the panelists just raised on the finance side. So it'd be great to hear from the two of you about some of the de-risking instruments you've either seen or that you've worked on that can help solve some of these problems and these challenges that have been raised on the finance side. So I'll start with you, Daphne, to speak about some of those solutions.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I think indeed Yeva could not have made a better bridge into the currency risks indeed, because I would love to start off with that particular topic. As I mentioned, I do work a lot with TCX, and through TCX also with MFX. I think if you look at where we are in this sector, indeed, even though, as Jeff mentioned, there is still donor money and the RBF schemes are picking up, but also you do see that loans are going into the sector. So much more debt funding than a few years ago is actually entering the sector. And with that, when there's the the hard currency money coming into the sector, it also introduces the local currency risks. I think indeed with what is important is that there are indeed instruments to hedge those. Yeva, you mentioned indeed that it's difficult and that it's often very mostly expensive. You are indeed adding the costs of average depreciation or the dollar lending costs to a loan that is sometimes already hard to cover by the companies and by the projects. So obviously, I think the best solution would be to also have more local currency financiers, local banks. So it's a pity that also, if you see it in these panels and the like, that those are still hard to find in the sector. So kind of as a go as an in-between solution, you do have the funds like TCX fund or MFX fund that can actually do the local currency hedging. It can be done for literally every single amount, every single currency, every single tenor. But obviously it is also adding to the cost very explicitly, because it's not the cost is rising because you're all obviously also then covering for the costs of volatility and the instability that you would normally have if you're not hedged. I loved what you said, Yeva, that it would be good to see if there's ways to also use donor funding or other ways to make it indeed less costly, because it is a bridge that needs to be taken. I think for a lot of the financiers, it is really important that by introducing hard currency lending into the sector, this is also hedged. And it is actually something that now is also being looked at together with TCX and MFX and other partners. It's very early stage still, but the realization is really there. If we look at where we come from in the PAYGO sector, where nowadays some larger investments are being made, and the effort that it has taken to actually also start introducing local currency hedging in those deals, we are really looking also at how to facilitate that for other parts of the sector, like indeed now the mini grid sector. So that is on top of the agenda, and we hope indeed to be able to talk more about it later in this year. But I think indeed the question was more general about risk and risk mitigation, so you don't have only the local currency risks. I think one of the other things is that could be a mitigation activity is actually to work together with programs like Get Invest Finance Catalyst or PFAN or others in the market that can indeed help companies to help them with their financial modeling, with all their business models and their investment strategy, to not just find, not just to help with all the documents and documentation, but also to help and set up a strong investment strategy so that you know which are the financiers that best fit with the actual project or company at hand. And I think my last point would be more on the sector as a whole. I think if you look at the sector broadly, what we have seen, and I think both Jeff and myself, we have worked quite a lot on the PAYGO Perform in the solar home systems sector, but data benchmarking, transparency in the market, I think also there we can still take some big steps, improve, and that would also help and make it easier for investors to step in, because you can actually do better comparisons between possible investments and make better choices.
Thank you for that response. And so, yeah, thank you for hitting the risk mitigation topics even outside of FX. I wanted to focus a bit deeper on this foreign exchange and the currency risk point that you hit. I know we know from our experience as cross-boundary energy access, and you'll see this also in the open source white paper, the real challenges of raising capital, debt, and equity in US dollars or euros. And when, as mini grid developers, mini grid companies, we're talking about earning capital in local currency and then being exposed to that huge FX risk. And so you mentioned there the work that you're doing with TCX, which is a firm that works on hedging currencies to help solve that. And I think, Cliff, you mentioned in your intro the work that you're doing on the side of local currency financing with the facility that you're launching, as well as I'm sure you've doing some additional work on the advisory side as far as helping mitigate some of these risks. So I'd like to hear a bit from you, Cliff, on the initiatives that are going on with Green Max Capital, as well as kind of some of the work that you're doing to help solve some of these challenges.
Thanks a lot, Humphrey, and thanks to all the other panelists for what's turning into a really good and deep discussion. So where we come in is yes, we agree. All these other risks, the regulatory issues have to be dealt with. There needs to be subsidy. There needs to be quality developers that have, learned how to properly control their costs, and to, build efficiently and operate efficiently. Uh, and in our perspective is we've reached a point in development of the industry where there's enough cadre of those opportunities, be it in Nigeria or Benin or Mali or Togo, Burkina Faso, Sierra Leone. There are places where those regulatory issues, in our opinion, have been adequately dealt with. There are combinations of local developers and international developers that we consider to be up to the task, and then there are subsidy programs structured in a lot of different ways, whether they're RBF or upfront subsidy, or organized like in Sierra Leone, where the subsidy actually paid for the initial installation of the sites 100%. A lot of different models, but there's enough that exists that now the question is, okay, we have those opportunities. All of those opportunities require some kind of debt solution and would best be served with local currency debt solutions. So, we look at each market individually and say, okay, where can we bring, without having to hedge dollar denominated debt into local currency debt? Are there local lenders? Is there ability of the local capital markets to take a look at these funding opportunities? And, we find increasingly the answer is yes. So Nigeria is a good example. Nigeria is the best example for everything in the mini grid space right now. It's the largest mini grid development laboratory on the planet. And just 2 weeks ago, the very first local currency debt deal was transacted by the Nigeria Infrastructure Debt Fund, which is a fund managed by a private fund manager, Chapel Hill Denham, which has been providing local currency debt solutions through the capital markets for about 5 years. They did their first mini grid deal with Haven Hill for a portfolio of mini grids that had received the results-based financing subsidy through the Rural Electrification Agency. And they are providing 100% debt financing for a $4.4 million portfolio, and they attach the RBF. So they're essentially providing a bridge loan on the RBF portion, as well as 100% upfront construction financing that then gets converted into a 12-year note. So there are emerging solutions, but what makes the Nigeria Infrastructure Debt Fund work in this case is they have built into their mechanism a first loss tranche funded by DFIs, funded in this case by the African Development Bank. So their institutional investors are inherently protected against loss. A second example from Nigeria is a new Central Bank of Nigeria funded credit line program, which provides low interest Naira denominated debt through local financial institutions to mini-grid developers who have also received the RBF funding through the Rural Electrification Agency program. And here we found an interesting phenomenon that the local lenders, even with this very cheap capital, I think it's 8 or 9% in Naira effectively today. And it's long-term money. It's 12-year money as well. The local financial institutions, are on the front line of risk. They have to repay these funds to CBN, and their primary concern, of course, is the payment performance, the economic viability of these mini grids to cover the debt service payments. We work with the local developers to develop each mini grid in a way that we can show that they can cover that debt service. But what does a banker think of? They think of what happens in the worst case, and the worst case is that they can't repay. And so what is the collateral that they can attach? The collateral that they can attach, of course, are the mini grid assets, but those are different assets on a project finance basis than would be a large power plant. Large power plant, you can repossess, you can refinance, you have real recourse to a fixed asset. A mini grid asset, let's face it, you're not going to pull out that asset and resell those panels somewhere else. Can't be done. And the industry is yet too nascent to be able to say, well, this mini grid developer failed. Bank can take those assets and can bring in another developer to run those assets more effectively. So this is, what a commercial banker is thinking about. So we developed the cash deposit facility from the Green for Access First Loss facility to be a physical cash reserve that covers up to 20% of loss across that portfolio. It's our belief that eventually 20% first loss isn't going to be necessary because we don't see defaults occurring, at least up till now, in the mini grid sector that warrant that. But the perception of risk by commercial lenders is, well, we want to be able to say that virtually 100% of our potential loss is covered. So we're saying we cover 100% of the first 20% of loss, which is much higher loss across a portfolio of loans than lenders would normally expect to see. And we're partnering with 3 lenders in Nigeria with this G4A facility. Unfortunately, G4A is not fully funded, and we're not ready to launch until later this year. But this is the concept that we're working on.
All right. Thank you for that, Cliff, and best of luck with of raising the Green for Access First Loss facility. It sounds like something that can truly make an impact. And also just you mentioned the transaction there with Haven Hill and the Nigerian Infrastructure Debt Fund. It's definitely exciting to see the local currency financing of that nature taking place, and big congratulations to Haven Hill for that as well. It is kind of it's really is a big deal. Something I want to hit is that typically a lot of times in this sector, it's the larger developers actually though that get a lot of the attention, whether it be from financiers or from donors, concessional capital. And a very important question that I want to ask is, how is it that we as financiers can do a better job of really opening up the market to these smaller developers who are looking to grow as well. And so I'll kick that question off with Alex to see how you respond to that.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, if we only focus on the large developers, the market is pretty small. And if we're going to achieve universal access, we need many players in this market, and especially local developers as well. I think as Infra Africa, it's something we think about and we find challenging to try and find solutions. I think from our perspective, some of the challenges we face with the smaller developers is, lack of track record and particularly capital as well to invest alongside somebody like Africa, who typically doesn't want to take a majority position, but a lot of these developers, even the more advanced ones, don't have large amounts of capital that they can sit on their balance sheets to invest in capital intensive infrastructure, and then there's the transaction costs as well. Negotiating deals and often multiple deals with multiple financiers. The transaction costs alone can be quite significant, and a lot of these developers don't have the sort of legal resource that they need to be able to sit alongside like large investors or even private sector investors. So I think it's definitely a challenge, and I think that as much as the whole sector needs concessional capital, I think there really does need to be a focus from the concessional financiers on these smaller developers and through providing that sort of corporate support to build them up and to get them to a point where they can then, scale and are ready to attract that larger infrastructure capital. Alongside that, more TA, I think, and maybe we could put this to the advisors on the panel.
Thanks for that, Alex. And yeah, I think you raised a lot of points there about some of those challenges there, and they are very real challenges. I think it'd be interesting to hear from the rest of the panel on how they see those challenges, and maybe particularly what are some of the solutions? What can we do? Because as Alex said, it's critical that we have be kind of deliberate and intentional in our approach to make sure that the smaller developers are getting access to some of this capital. And right now, there do seem to be a lot of challenges. So how do we fix that? And I think that Daphne or Ieva, do either of you want to touch base on that?
Yeah, I can jump in first, although I'm sure I'll probably even reference Daphne, so that will be a good lead-in as well again. But I think this is a super important question, and I would link it sort of smaller investments, smaller developers. I guess it's still in the current market very linked to the question of more support going to local developers, which is very important for Camco and for REP, and that's something we try to pay attention to. I think generally REP is quite well positioned to support smaller scale developers. Not to say that in our portfolio there's no space for improvement. There certainly is. But the fact, and that's probably the first ingredient, so to be able to be more flexible on, let's say the quantum of financing. So just to highlight sort of, the scale, and maybe that's not our sweet spot, so to say, but we have provided development financing. So to GVE in Nigeria, that was under $300,000, and to Arc Power in Rwanda, that was also the first convertible loan was £300,000. Which was then upscaled through a second convertible loan. So we can also do, sort of a scale up with developers that we work with, and maybe that's also part of the solution. I think, and this is where it leads to Daphne. So I think it's very important to, if you have the capacity as a funder, to sort of go the journey together with the developers to provide the technical assistance. If you can't do that, then partnerships are very important, and that's where REP has been very happy to be partnering with Get Invest, not just in the mini grid space, but also in the broader renewable energy landscape in sub-Saharan Africa. But I think I would stress one aspect for the funders, that it's important to take the step to actually matchmake effectively. So, whether it's for additional financiers to come into a deal or whether it's for others to provide technical assistance, I think it's important to, go the step of making the introductions if you feel that you cannot provide it in-house. I would also maybe challenge some funders. I don't know if it's only funders on the panel, but this is a question that we, as part of the Minigrid Funders Group, have been also trying to crack lately, which is sort of more partnerships between funders. And it was mentioned by Alex that for smaller scale deals, DD costs, for example, become quite costly. And so here the question would be, can we try to move towards more collaboration as financiers on that side? And this is again something that is part of REP's mandate and that we are trying to achieve. Also on legal DD, it's possible as an option for the lenders to perhaps finance the due diligence from the loan to then be deducted from the first disbursement. So that's also that I think something that can help. But finally, so beyond the role that I think financiers can play a more active role, I wanted to throw, I don't know what's the expression, to throw something into the fire, but to sort of raise the question of, we are really keen on scaling up the sector. And I think it's very important and very, very welcome that we have seen larger scale development partner funding coming in for these, national level programs through often large scale concession agreements. I think that's very important for sector development, for scaling up, but it can, in my opinion, sometimes disadvantage smaller or more local developers. So I guess the question there is also for the development partners and governments to play a role in thinking through how to make these programs or policies smarter in a way to not have this negative effect.
Okay. Thank you for that. I want to, we are trying to move quickly to the audience Q&A here. So if you've been asking questions or if you have questions, please put them in the chat. And so go ahead, Daphne, to add a bit of context and color to that response.
Thank you, Humphrey. There's indeed two things I would like to point out. The first is if you look at a country like Burkina Faso, I know I've been doing quite a bit of work in Burkina Faso as well last year with UNCDF trying to put together a challenge fund for off-grid energy. We were working a lot together also with other donors like AECF in the Beyond the Grid Fund Africa to really try to align the different programs to each other and to really see, okay, how can we build up this market also for the local developers and the local companies. So really to see which finance program can do what and how can we build upon each other? How can a developer grow from really early stage concessional finance to more and more commercial finance? For instance, I know that with UNCDF, the Challenge Fund was mainly grant money, but there was also the possibility to introduce them to the investment platform of UNCDF to actually also have loans as part of the solution there. Not necessarily because a company wanted to have the loan, but also to help build the sector and to build indeed this investability. And I think I also sometimes sit on the other side of the table, as Eva already pointed out, when I'm doing work with the Get Invest Finance Catalyst. I think indeed what we do it's a multi-donor funded program to really help companies become investable. And we always start with first finding the right finance strategy for a company, which might mean also really looking for, it's also for local companies and it's also for the smaller mini grids that don't need the 10 million to start with. So to really see, okay, what should be your investment strategy? What part should be equity, debt, and concessional finance, or a mix of them, and where then should you go? To really find then the precise kind of sort of finance and to help them to reach that, to understand it, and to also be introduced to the right sort of financiers. which can often also be smaller financiers. I think here we have a group of very well-known financiers, but you do see, fortunately, that there are also smaller, less-known financiers in the sector that also play a role in building up the financeability of the smaller companies, and with that, indeed, also I think of the sector as a whole. So I think those are the points that I wanted to make. That you can see that there's really partners that are trying to also step in on the more challenging sides of the spectre, and that are also indeed trying to be in maybe the more challenging countries or the more challenging earlier stage parts of the entire ladder. Which I think is needed to indeed also prove investability. And in that, I think I very much echo what both Yeva and Alex were already saying. And I think in a way also, Jeff, when you started with the very first remark, when you're answering the very first question, that it is still a search for investable and good, strong business cases. And that there are very many different parties now trying to play a part in that. And I think that is really key to the end solution, that it's not, that we really need those many actors to actually solve it.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Daphne. Cliff, is there anything you'd like to add with this perspective of local developers here?
Yeah, I'll be quick, but I want to be a bit forceful here. Let's not pull any punches, right? If you look at the off-grid space overall, since this space began, 90% of capital flow has been into international companies. 90%. That's wrong from an equity point of view, and it's dumb from a sustainability point of view. However, do we really, really believe that there are not inherent biases built in to the international investment and international donor system that prevent that from changing on a wholesale basis? Yes, we see some individual, attempts to flow more capital to local developers, but honestly, it feels mostly like lip service, I'm sorry to say. So we think there's three pillars to change this situation. First, technical assistance. There are plenty of TA programs that exist, but quite honestly, they just touch the surface. They're designed for companies that already are ready to go to market. There's not enough deep dive technical assistance available that really builds up local capacity. There's just not enough. Second, when subsidy programs are being developed by the donor institutions in partnership with their country partners, there has to be local content requirements that are aggressive. There just has to be, and there has not been up to date. And thirdly, let's remember in the real world that who is most likely to partner with a local developer is local capital, and they're best suited to do so. So let's focus our risk mitigation instruments on enabling local capital sources to participate more aggressively in this field.
Wow. Thank you for that, Cliff, and really appreciate you not pulling any punches in that response. And I hope that this is being recorded, because I think there were a lot of great points made there. Jeff, I want to ask you to comment on this question, and then we can move into the audience Q&A.
Yeah, so just very quickly, I would echo what Cliff said. Wow, there's, clearly bias, I think, in the way, and, we have to take on some of that ourselves, just in the way that the system works. And I think it's, that's something that extends beyond mini grids. It's across all of the sectors that we look at. you can see that coming through. So I think that's a deep topic that definitely deserves a lot of attention. But just coming back to this, I mean, I think, looking on the equity side, I think, one way that can be addressed is through partnership, where, you have more explicit collaboration between, say, international investors that can bring capital and leverage the expertise and local knowledge of smaller local developers to kind of get the right mix around. And then from the debt perspective, kind of wearing my DFI hat, I mean, I think if you just have DFIs running around, trying to cherry pick the best deals, then that's inevitably going to lead you to the biggest, most well-connected developers getting the capital. So I think maybe one idea to address that would be sort of at country level, and we've been talking a lot about the need for, kind of collaboration and coordination to try to create the right conditions, whether it's around regulatory or subsidies. But I think also we could look at, say, DFIs or other interested impact funds that want to support a country program where, for example, they're giving out mini-grid concessions and making a co-financing facility available to everyone who qualifies under that program to try to level the playing field so that any developer, big or small, that is awarded mini-grid sites within a country program could then tap into that facility to just try to level things out a bit. So those are a couple thoughts.
Thank you for that, Jeff. And I mean, no, I think there have been some really, really great ideas coming out of this panel, and I hope someone's really taken some good notes, because these are things that we definitely need to be communicating to the wider sector, and they could definitely make an impact on how, like you said, we can level the playing field and just increase finance to a broader group of developers in this sector. So we're going to jump into the audience Q&A. As I said, there have been some questions coming through on the platform that we are going to address. And if you still have questions, please feel free to put them on the platform so that we can try to address them in the 14 or so minutes we have remaining. The first question was, is project finance the appropriate finance solution here? And diving deeper into the question, it was about the fact that the mini-grid developers are often quite small, and that they need finance to bundle multiple sites, and otherwise overheads are too high. And so I'll take this question myself, or partially myself, with a focus towards the open sourcing document that we had put out. And so this really, the approach that we've taken there is really about using project finance to bring capital to a developer's portfolio or their pipeline of mini grids. And so I'm obviously biased in that I think that project finance can be a solution for small developers, because you bring in alternate capital that can, through an SPV, take those assets off of your balance sheet and finance them at scale, and finance not only your operating projects, but also your pipeline as well. And then the limited capital that developers do have for strategic activities, corporate activities, overheads, et cetera, it can be used on that, as opposed to being stuck in mini grid assets that are generating, let's say, long-term but low yield, inflation linked cash flows there. And so I do believe that project finance is something that can be quite helpful for small developers in this regard. And so at the same time, it's worth mentioning that when you do use a project finance approach, it's important that those developers and operators also step into a long-term operating contract, which should have obviously a balance of incentives between the different parties, but at the same time should be paying the operator for their activities from an operating standpoint, and also helping cover some of those overheads as well. So from my admittedly biased perspective, I do think that it is something that can work for small developers, but would like to see if any of the other panelists would like to touch base on that question as well.
I can just maybe jump in to add. I mean, I do think there are a lot of aspects of mini grids that you can sort of look at through a project finance lens. I think one of the areas, and I think Cross Boundary has highlighted this in your work, but one area where it doesn't map very well, I think, is around demand and offtake. So, if you compared to a typical IPP, you've got sort of fixed offtake. Whereas I think a lot of the mini grid opportunities that we've seen, it's really more of a merchant type of offtake situation. You're dealing with individual households. They are captive to that mini grid, but there are definitely constraints around ability to pay. And a lot of the story is around being able to build that demand up over time. So I think an interesting element that can help around that that I mentioned earlier is trying to find ways that you can build in more certainty around demand. And I think, particularly building on some of the advantages of mini grids being able to power productive use. So how much sort of productive use kind of SME offtake can you build into that will also, I think, contribute to revenue growth and income growth in the local communities that can create a virtuous cycle around energy use and support the viability of the mini grids in longer term.
Awesome. Thank you for that response. And no, I'm actually surprised the term productive use hasn't come up more in this discussion. That is obviously such a critical part of mini grids and the mini grid business model. And I'm sure that in this AMDA AGM, this is something that we'll be hearing a lot more about. Is there anybody else on the panel who would like to weigh in on that question before I move to the next audience question? All right. So next, there were a couple of specific questions for you, Jeff, about CDC. So I think one question was a bit about your ticket size. So it'd be great if you could give a bit of clarification on your ticket size. And then secondly, I think this was also directed to you a bit about kind of how you see the use of subsidy and donor funds, and maybe the wider group can also maybe weigh in a bit on that question. So I'll start with you, Jeff, and then I'll open that question up to the wider folks, maybe a bit about donor funds and subsidies.
So I think in general, CDC is a larger ticket investor. Whether on the equity or debt side, the bulk of our investment book is going to be in utility scale type of opportunities in the energy space that are much larger. But then, acknowledging that in energy access, decentralized energy, the opportunities are smaller. We've tried to adapt our approach, starting with the solar home systems area, which is where we sort of got started in energy access and looking at some smaller tickets there. And then as we developed our strategy around mini grids, I think we realized that the sector is even smaller still. So, whereas we might be looking for tickets typically, sort of 10 million, 20 million, even larger than that in other sectors, in the mini grid space, we're trying to be flexible and look at smaller tickets, that could be even, a bit less than 5 million. So that's sort of what we'd be looking at from a ticket size perspective. But we do need to have some level of aggregation. We have just for efficiency and costs, that's what's going to make sense for us. And then on the question of subsidies, I mean, I think, we all have to recognize the capital that we're managing and the constraints and flexibilities attached to that capital. So in the case of CDC, and I think this is true for, all DFIs and, some of our other DFIs that are looking at the mini grid space, is that, we don't give grants, and we can't lose money, which is not to say that we never lose money on an individual investment, but on a portfolio basis, we actually have to make a return and cover all of our costs. And so that just corresponds to a certain level of risk that we can take. So I think in the mini grid space, we are risk takers. We're willing to take on some risk, but we can't do everything. And we see in this case, a very clear need for donors that can actually provide, TA and money that's not going to come back. to support and buy down some of the costs to make the investments viable for the developers, and then also DFIs that can accept perhaps a lower return but still need to count on the capital coming back.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that, Jeff. If there's I think you hit something quite important there, though. Maybe to the wider subsidy question is why do we still need subsidy? I think it's something that a lot of folks are always asking questions about. I know that obviously a lot of the folks that are part of this discussion and listening in probably are quite well versed with this, but it's just always worth mentioning that the idea of using subsidy to bring power to rural populations is not something that's new, right? This is something that in the United States, in China, and Brazil, they all had subsidy when it came to electrifying the rural populations. So when it comes to mini grids, to me, it's never really a question of the mini grid business model. I feel like the mini grid business model itself is quite robust, right? It's got much cheaper inputs, and it's able to generate electricity and have much higher uptime, a better service than most of the national utilities on this continent. The challenge with mini grids is that they are being used to electrify rural populations, and when it comes to rural electrification globally, that has almost always required subsidy. And so I think that's always something worth keeping in mind. We have about 5 minutes left. So I think there were some additional questions, and unfortunately we won't be able to get to all of them. But what I would like to do is give each of the panelists an opportunity to give a last 30 seconds final thoughts to leave this group with. I think it's been an awesome discussion. So I think this time we'll go in reverse alphabetical order. So I'll start with Yeva.
Thank you. I think a lot has been said, actually. It's exciting that this panel was quite diverse, and I think there are many more actors now coming into the field. I do think that partnerships among the funders, as well as with different other stakeholders, so donors, development partners, and governments in particular, are very important. And I hope that we can see this open conversation happening. There are very important questions to answer, such as the tariff question. Versus the subsidies, or related to that, the subsidies. So there are important issues to still be tackled. So I think let's continue to be open and frank, as I think this discussion has been, and I think that would help the sector to move forward.
Thanks. Jeff?
I just want to thank everyone, and I think we come to this with a lot of humility. We have a lot to learn. I think we probably all are going to be on a pretty steep learning curve, and I think we have to be prepared to be flexible and to experiment as we figure out how to finance and develop this new asset class. But we really look at mini grids as a way to complement what we're doing across the board, whether it's at utility scale or with solar home systems. I think we need all of these solutions to address the challenge, and I think there's clearly a role for mini grids, in the fully electrified future. So looking forward to working with partners to build this industry. Thank you.
Thanks. About 1 minute left. So Daphne?
I'll try to be quick. I think indeed it's great that we see so many commercial solutions, and that there is so much focus on sustainable business models and investable models. But I think it's also great to see that there are so many donor-funded programs, like indeed TCX, like the Get Invest Finance Catalyst, that can really help to mitigate risks and to help scale up the sector. And that would be part indeed of the partnerships that I think Jeff mentioned. So that would be my last few words for today.
Cliff? Cliff, I think you're on mute.
We should take a quick step back and realize, how far this industry has come in a very short amount of time, and that's a great thing. When you compare what mini grids looked like 3, 4, 5 years ago, and what they look like today. Big difference. At the same time, and referring to one of the questions about can we actually hope to meet the SDG 7 goal in time? Look, we have to be realistic. The largest mini grid developer in the world closed on, commissioned their 100th mini grid last month. And we need 180,000 mini grids in Africa. That's a long way to go. So let's all work together to try to meet that goal, but let's not go crazy and think that it's actually going to happen, a few years from now. It's going to be a long slog ahead, but, I think we should all be encouraged by the way so many disparate elements have come together and started to focus on the solutions.
Great. Alex?
Sure. I mean, yeah, some great comments. I'm not sure there's a lot more to add, to be honest. But yeah, I think there has been great traction. But it feels like we're almost at a make or break point. We really need to see, more kind of and continued donor support, more growth, investment, and yeah, I just echo everybody else's comments that there really does need to be a kind of collaborative approach to some of these challenges if we're going to make them successful.
All right. Thank you. So, with that, apologies for going a bit over time. Huge thanks to everybody on this panel. I think this was a really, really robust and exciting discussion. I think I'll have to follow up with some of you individually. And then thank you to the AMDA team for having us on. I hope that the panel, the audience found it as exciting as I did. And take care. Thanks. Bye.